Uncharted Magic by Elton Gar. Gerina watched the ship sail over the horizon. The 6-foot-tall stockade that surrounded the village seemed much smaller than it had when there were several dozen armed sailors patrolling it, and a weather wizard protected them from the elements. She then looked around at the other colonists. Most of them had knives on their belts, but those weren't so much weapons as tools that could be used to defend yourself. The only other defense was the few hunters who would hopefully be the main source of food. Only a few seconds after the ship disappeared, Mayor Colonea said,
"Okay, everyone. It's time to get to work."
As the colonists' wizard, Gerina didn't have to do the menial tasks that everyone else did. But that didn't mean she had nothing to do, so she walked to the bunkhouse, one of 3 buildings in the village. Scattered around in the bunks were people too lazy to even come out to see the ship off. She went to her bunk and found one of her bunkmates in it. So she pulled out the box she kept underneath it and took out the small bone focuses she had been working on. She then sat on the ground and held the twisted bones and feathers in front of her and focused. She had tried all the focuses she had brought with her. Only the small stone statue had worked at all, and it had barely been useful. The magic here was simply too wild to be filtered by the same tools that focused the refined and controlled magic of the homeland. What made up for the lack of refinement of the magic was its power. In the homeland, there were so many people using the magic, and it was so regulated by them, that someone who didn't already have a significant amount of magical power was barely able to do enough to stay alive. Here the magic flowed through everything, even if how unrefined it was made it almost impossible to control. Among the many things that needed to be done, there were only a few that would be far easier for Gerina to do than the 60 other people using their hands. Her power wouldn't make collecting firewood or building houses any easier, and she wouldn't fill the storehouse any faster. So she focused on a spot near the center of the town and reached deep into the ground. The roughness of the magic made the fine job of sensing what was there more difficult, but delving for water was easy, and the difference between the water and earth didn't require much precision to sense. She had never had enough power, or a good reason to create a well in the homeland, but she had read about the procedure enough times that it felt almost routine. First, she connected with the water. That part at least the magic didn't fight against. Unlike the refined magic she was used to, this magic was in many ways the water and the earth. That would have to be fixed over time to come in line with the magic of the homeland, but for now she would work with what she had. She lifted the water, allowing it to infuse the ground. Then she pulled it away from the dirt and stone in small steps, allowing the water to do most of the work. The eruption of stone, dirt, and water covered most of the village, and rocks the size of fists battered the ground. People began to run, and one of the chickens was killed. The hole was far bigger than Gerina had intended, and rather than having smooth walls along a straight shaft, it was a crater with steep walls and a pool of water at the bottom. Gerina looked at it for several seconds, then began to throw up. She emptied her stomach onto the grass, and then continued to try for almost a full minute. As that began to recede, the shivering began. Someone grabbed Gerina. She was too exhausted to see which, or to tell the oaf to keep his hands off her. So he brought her into the bunkhouse and covered her with several blankets. She tried to say thank you, but the words were unintelligible, and so she allowed her eyes to shut. She didn't sleep, but she allowed the magic to dissipate, and as it left her, she began to return slowly to normal. After what seemed days, but was likely hours, Colonea shook her lightly and said,
"There is someone here to see you."
Still exhausted, she made enough effort to tip over so that she was laying flat on her back, the rough wood planks of the bunk above her. She didn't say anything for several seconds, then got out the word,
"What?" One of the natives arrived. He said he wanted to see the idiot shaman, who almost killed herself.
Irritated more by being called a shaman than an idiot, Gerina used that anger to gather up enough energy to stand and said,
"Help me up."
Her clothes were dripping in sweat, and her mouth was dry, but she stumbled out of the bunkhouse and to the single small door that had been built into the stockade that surrounded the village. The person outside was about 4 feet tall, with green skin and arms that were almost twice as they should be. He had pointy ears that stuck up in the air. He slapped her across the face with 3 fingers that were twice as long as they should be.
"If you were my apprentice, I would have you beaten for doing something so stupid.
Colonea put her hand on the knife at her belt, but Gerina gritted her teeth and put her hand on the woman's arm, stopping her. This man knew the magic here better than she did, and he might be useful, so she said,
Would you attack someone for telling the truth?
So you show some hint of wisdom after all, and yet you do not seek aid in understanding.
I studied a great deal. The magic here is simply different from what I know. I tried to do something that would be considered small and simple where I am from.
Digging a hole is simple here too, though I do not understand the point. There is a river just outside of your wall.
The shaman said.
It doesn't seem all that simple. I barely pushed and it exploded.
Gerina said.
I understand that the magic in your land is nearly dead. Because of that, you push the magic. But here you ask the magic to do something for you. If it likes you, it will comply. Some of the stronger shaman can even convince it to do more.
I will take that into consideration.
Gerina said. The idea that she would allow the magic to be in control made her almost ill. Not that it was easy to tell, since her stomach was still queasy from trying to use magic the last time. The small thing looked at her for several seconds, then nodded, and then turned and walked into the forest. As he did, Colonea said,
When did you learn their language?
What?
Gerina asked.
You spoke in a language I have never heard before.
Colonea said. That wasn't possible. Magic could do many things, but to learn new skills like a language would require an intelligence and ability to understand the language that magic didn't have. That made her wonder if perhaps she had underestimated how much different the magic was here. Whatever it was, she would have to be far more careful. But for now, she stepped back inside the stockade, nodding at the three men with weapons drawn that had been standing just out of sight of the shaman. One of them stepped forward and slid a large piece of wood through the loops on the door, making it impossible to open from the outside and cutting them off from the dangers of this strange land. Gerina was still exhausted, and it was the middle of the night, but she wasn't tired, so she found one of the handful of chairs that had been crafted since they got here. It was rough and had no padding, but it allowed her to relax without returning to the crowded bunkhouse. Colonea brought her one of the blankets that she pulled around herself, and Gerina watched the stars. Even they were different here. In the homeland, there was so much light you couldn't see more than a handful, but here there were millions. That felt like a metaphor of the endless possibilities here. Gerina was the first true wizard to stay in these lands. And while she had to be more careful, she was going to be able to shape the wild and rough magic of this place in a way that no one had been able to shape magic in 1,000 years. It would be her fingerprints on the magic of this land. For now, she took the shaman's advice. She allowed the magic to take the lead as she turned the huge hole she had created into a well. She didn't try to force the earth aside or pull on the water. She simply explained in her mind what she wanted and allowed it to work. What she got wasn't a traditional well. That was far too structured for the strange wild magic. Instead, she created a spring that the water bubbled out of, and a pool for it to fill. Each step of the process took far more power than it needed, as she had to melt and shape the rock around the edge of the pool, and getting the spring both straight and in the center of the pool of water took a dozen tries. And even when it was done, there was no pulley system or walls to hold in the water, so it was more difficult to get the water out. Everyone else seemed content, and some of the people seemed to like it more than a well. But it wasn't how things were meant to be done. Still, they could fix that over time, building up rocks around the edge until it was more like the well it was supposed to be. With the well as finished as it was going to be, Gerina was largely left alone. She sometimes helped with minor tasks, but her main job was to be ready to defend the village from whatever monsters or tribes might be in this strange land. That was fine with her. She had come here not because she wanted to clean fish or cook meals, but because it was a way for someone who deserved power to gain it. So instead of doing the menial labor that the others did, she worked with the magic. She still hadn't been able to control it without becoming sick, but she thought she felt it beginning to bend more to her. Most of what she used it for didn't need to be all that refined. It would have been nice if the rocks she lifted up to create her tower were smooth and uniform, but she was still able to fuse them together and turn the outer layer of the tower into a liquid for a few seconds so that it became smooth and more cohesive. It made the entire tower look a bit like a giant wax candle with stone wax running down the side. But as she gathered more power, she could remove that and make it the smooth stone that reflected the sunlight that a wizard's tower should have. The other problem was that she had no good way to make good stone stairs. She could have made a ramp that curled around the inside of the tower, but she doubted it would be as uniform as she'd like. The magic tended to wand to bend and move with the stone rather than follow her will. For now, she would simply use the bottom of the tower. She didn't have much to store, and it let her have a place to sleep without sharing a bunk with 2 other people. First, she needed a bed. The bunks were still better than the planks they had on the ship, and with each day they were able to add more padding to them, mostly made up of deerskins, but they were better than simply sleeping on rough wood planks. Gerina began to make the bed. Taking a number of long, thick poles, she coaxed the magic through them. It wasn't entirely dissimilar to how she might make a magic staff in the old world, but here it allowed her to make the wood twist and bend. It took 4 times as long as it should to move it into a shape that was a bed, mostly because no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't convince the sticks to be entirely straight. It was as if the nature of the tree wanted to be bent, and while the twisting branches created something that would hold her, it simply wasn't dignified to sleep in something so rustic. Eventually, Gerina just gave in to the idea that she'd be sick, and straightened enough sticks to make the bed, though she allowed the legs, headboard, and posts to be twisted for now to avoid becoming too ill to stand. Even though the branches were still round and not as smooth as she would like, the curves of the bed were gentle and seemed to contour to her body well enough, and she had the first good night's sleep that Gerina had had in the 3 months since she left the homeland. With that, she allowed herself to be drawn into the magic in her sleep. With how untamed the magic was, it felt dangerous, but she allowed it to move her, because every time she tried to push against it to go where she wanted, it felt as if she were pushing against a tornado. As she moved over the land, she knew she was the first person to see this land clearly. Not that it was entirely clear. The magic seemed to distort things. Those things that were more magical were bigger, while other things were smaller. But she saw that it was far, far larger than she had ever imagined. Perhaps bigger than the homeland. Then, as she was swooping over a steep hill, someone moved up next to her. It was bigger than before, but there was no doubt that it was the native shaman who had slapped her. He said,
You have gained some small hint of understanding, but you continue to fight against it. Had you simply told it you wanted a bed, well, let me show you.
He landed near a still live tree and put his hand on it. The entire tree began to twist and shape, and in what seemed only seconds, it had created a bed. But it was more of a large bowl than what she was used to, and there were knots and even a few twigs sticking out, though none where she would sleep, and she had to admit it was likely more comfortable than what she had made.
Doing that might have been easier once, but once I control the magic, there are many things I can do that simply can't be done now. We have wizards who can control the weather and knock down city walls. We have boats that can cross the ocean, and weapons that can make our soldier become the match for any 10 without them.
Then why are you here?
The shaman asked.
Because I wasn't the one who controlled it.
And even after you have seen the power of working with the magic, you still wish only to control it, or more accurately, to take that control and lock it away from everyone else.
The shaman said. Gerina wanted to lie. She wanted to tell him that she was willing to work with the magic, but she couldn't lie. The magic of this place wanted to know, and it still controlled itself.
Yes, I want power. I don't want things to be the way they are or natural. I want to shape them into my image.
There have been others like you on these shores. We had hoped that you might be different. We will allow you a choice. You may give up your magic and remain here, or you will be returned home.
I will not. I can fight you,
Gerina said.
You truly believe that? I am sorry,
The shaman said. Gerina pulled at the magic around her, attempting to force it to her will to fight against the magic of the shaman. As she did, she understood. Every time she had tried to push against the magic, and it had budged, it had been the magic allowing her to have her own way. She had never controlled the magic. The magic plucked her up, almost gently, and placed her back into her own body. Then, with a force that was both powerful beyond what she could comprehend, and barely a breeze, it picked up the entire colony, and returned it to the motherland, along with all memories that this land was here at all. All memories except those that Gerina carried. As she thought about that, she understood. That land wanted the connection with the rest of the world. but it refused to be dominated. So it would wait until people had learned. But as Gerina felt the weak, beat-down magic of this land, she wondered if they would ever learn.
Author's note. I like the idea of writing stories about people exploring new lands. I enjoy the magic of discovery, but I am always very nervous about it. That is why I will most often write stories about worlds where there are no intelligent people. Even then, there may be some moral questions, but I'm more willing to push the boundaries of damaging the environment than those that damage people. I feel this story is safer because the colony is in service of the other aspect of the story. That is the desire to control things that do not need to be or want to be controlled. The need to tame nature and bend it to our will instead of learning to use the natural power. Neither is a perfect option, of course. Humans do need some control over their environment to survive in most parts of the world, but they don't need to dominate it. Those are choices made in part by people who are too attached to the way things are and the way things look than the way they could be. Sometimes I am one of those people, but I try not to be. I hope everyone enjoyed it. If you did, you can sign up for my newsletter at www.ansci-fi.com. Just follow the link that says free book, or you can sign up for my Patreon and get access to all of my short stories. Elton Gar.